And welcome to this video, which will be focusing on theme 4's poverty and inequality topic. So this is 4.2 from the specification. The content which we will be covering in this video is now on the screen. So we're going to be looking at absolute and relative poverty, and we're going to be looking at inequality as well. Right, okay, now first things first, what I would like you to do, please, can you jot down these questions, hit pause, write down your answers, and then once you've done that, hit play and compare what you've written against what I think the answer should be. Right, everyone, so what you can see on the screen here are the definitions of both absolute and relative poverty. Now, the idea is absolute poverty is a fixed definition. So wherever you go in the world, the definition of absolute poverty is fixed. And how we measure people in absolute poverty is also fixed. So this is where household income is below the necessary level to maintain basic living standards. So this is often measured through what we call the poverty line, which suggests that if your income is below $1.90 per day using the PPP exchange rate method, then you are said to live in absolute poverty. People that live in absolute poverty cannot afford basic essentials. So this could include food, shelter, housing, but I'd also include healthcare, excuse me, even basic education in that definition as well. Now, relative poverty will vary from country to country across the world. The idea is we're measuring poverty now, looking at the gap between the richer people and the poorer people within a society. So what we often say is, in many countries across the world, we look here at median income. So what we do is we rank everyone from lowest to highest income. We find the person slap bang in the middle, and we say if you earn 50 or maybe 60% below what that person earns, then you are said to exist or live in relative poverty. So in the UK, this often works out for those people who earn roughly below £13,000 per year. Now, this therefore means that these people will not be able to access what most people within that society would expect to be essential for a good standard of living. So in the UK, relative poverty could be linked to people who are in 0-hour contract work, unemployment, etc., disabilities where benefits might not be sufficient to afford a good standard of living in the UK economy. So in the UK, this could be people that can't afford to buy their own home, cannot afford to buy cars, or they might find that public transport costs or energy bills form a significant proportion of their income. So they're excluded from what the average person across our economy would deem essential for a good standard of living. Now, the idea would be that relative poverty will clearly vary from country to country. Okay, so median income will vary from country to country. So what you've got to earn in a country to be in relative poverty will also vary from country to country. This will clearly change over time as well. So as economies grow, the income deemed necessary for a good standard of living in a country will change. So as median incomes increase, how much money you've got to earn to escape relative poverty will also change. Right, next question, everyone. Again, if you can jot down these 4 different questions covering question 2, A, B, C and D. Once you've written them down, put down your answers, obviously whilst pausing my video. Once you've got down your answers, if you can again hit play, please. Right, so what you can now see then is how we compare economic growth against economic development. So growth is about an increase in GDP. Now, the assumption would be that poverty should fall as economies grow, with the logic being as GDP or the value of output of an economy increases, if we then calculate the GDP per capita, you would expect average incomes to increase. And this should mean that at least absolute poverty starts to fall. So it should help people escape that poverty line and start to be able to afford essentials. Now, the reason for this is as economies grow, there's more employment opportunities, which means people can earn higher incomes. They can maybe start to pay more tax money, which can be used to fund better healthcare, education, and therefore allow more people to access what we call a basic safety net. In other words, receive government support to allow them to afford, at the very least, the basic essentials for survival. What we're going to be a bit careful of, though, is that growth alone will not guarantee a reduction in poverty. Because what we might find is that as economies grow, we have an increase in relative poverty driven by inequality. And this is linked to the trickle-down effect. As economies grow, those that own assets and have lots of wealth will probably see their incomes increase by more than the poorest people across society. So those with shares will receive more dividends, their share values will increase, they will have more wealth built up in their now more valuable property they might own. Business owners might see profits increase, whereas for the poorest people, all they're accessing are hopefully better job opportunities, which might see incomes increase a little bit. So what you might find is that the incomes of the top earners increase significantly, whereas for the lower income earners, they don't grow quite so much. And that could mean more people in that society are in relative poverty. Therefore, say that for growth to reduce poverty, it needs to be pro-poor. In other words, focus on the lowest income earners as opposed to the highest income earners. So growth is about an increase in GDP. Development is about an increase in living standards. So hopefully remember that we can measure development by looking at the Human Development Index, access to education, average years in schools, expected number of years in schools, life expectancy, average income levels. Well, what you would assume is if living standards increase, there should be a reduction in poverty. Okay, now obviously governments can influence how many people are in poverty by adjusting taxes and spending. So for example, within the UK, we have a progressive tax system, which means as you earn more money, you pay a higher percentage tax on your income. Well, that should do something to alleviate at least relative poverty, especially when that money is then redistributed back to poorer people through things such as universal credit, so increased access to benefits for lower income people. So that can be used to address the gap between rich and poor. Clearly, governments can also influence the gap by adjusting minimum wage rates. So if we increase them over time, more so than the incomes of top earners, then we should have a reduction in relative poverty in a country. Right, next question. Again, there's an A, B and a C link to this one here. Again, write them down, hit pause, put down your answers, and once you've got your answers down, again, hit play, please. Right, so income against wealth then, first of all. So income is the returns generated by people when they supply their factors of production, so their resources. So for most of us, we supply our labour, and that will enable us to generate wages. But those that own wealth, such as shares or businesses or property, they might be able to generate returns from those assets as well. So dividends on shares, profits on businesses, rent on property that might be owned. We could even stick into that category interest on savings in the bank as well. Wealth, on the other hand, is assets that are owned by people. This could be cash in the bank, so savings that have been built up over time. It could be shares that people own or businesses, or it could be property. Okay, so the idea is you would assume that as incomes increase, people have an increased ability to generate more wealth. And obviously, the more wealth you've got, you can then generate more incomes from those assets that you've got as well. Now, all inequality is then is the unequal distribution of income and wealth. In other words, across our society, in every society across the world, to varying degrees, there's a gap in income and wealth between the richest and the poorest people in a society. Obviously, the bigger that gap is, the more likely there'll be people in absolute and or relative poverty within an economy. Right, so what causes income inequality? Well, a lot of it is down to labour markets. So if you happen to work in a profession where there are high demand for your services and there's a relatively low supply of people that can do your job, well, supply and demand would suggest that you will generate high incomes from your labour. Obviously linked to that as well, if you're in a profession where there's a very low demand and a high supply of people like you, then that will also lead to a gap, lower incomes for those people. In Britain, we tend to find that people who are low skilled will generate lower incomes than those that are higher skilled. Lower skilled professions are more likely to be industries where we've got 0-hour contract work, underemployment, so irregular hours, insecure employment protection, and that tends to lead to lower incomes for those people. compared to more established higher skill professions where incomes tend to be higher. Another one is just non-workers. So many people don't work. This could be the elderly, people who've retired and have not saved up sufficient pensions, the disabled or unable to work, people who are sick would fall into that category as well, and the unemployed. So clearly these people will not earn as much, generally anyway, than those that do work, and that can lead to inequality. We then look at wealth as well. So the logic would be that those who have got assets, lots of wealth built up, property, etc., shares, businesses, they'll be able to generate more income from those assets than those that don't have that wealth in the first place. The data also shows that household composition can have a big impact on inequality. So households that have a high number of dependents, so lots of children, for example, will mean that the incomes of those that are working is being spread over more people that live in that household. That is why when we look at development economics, we often say that one big policy to reduce inequality and poverty is to encourage people to have fewer children, okay, because the income is shared across more people and that could push more people into some form of poverty. Government policy can also affect this as well. So governments set taxes and they spend money on the economy, and they can also contribute towards poverty and inequality as well. Right, you've got some causes of wealth inequality here. So you've got there again a definition of what wealth actually is, and you've got here some of the reasons for it as well. And a lot of these overlap with some of the previous ones. So it could be income levels. So people that will earn more money will be able to save up more, build up more wealth, etc. So for example, those with higher incomes can afford to buy more property. They can afford to buy more shares, invest in more pension schemes, save more money in the bank, which allows them to build up more wealth. Now, the next one, obviously those with wealth can use that wealth to increase future wealth. So the idea is those that have got lots of wealth will be generating lots of incomes from that wealth. Of course, that can then be reinvested into more property, more shares to create even more wealth. The next one is inheritance. Now, this can be financial. So, you know, mum or dad or grandparents, other family members or friends might leave in their wills inheritance for people. This could be property, it could be shares, again, it could be savings in the bank. And again, this would lead to wealth inequality because some people will inherit more than what others will do. Inheritance, though, can also be things that you gain from your family which are not financial. So maybe your family instilling you a really important work ethic. Maybe your background helps you develop certain skills and makes you motivated to succeed and work hard. Now, clearly those people with those skills and those assets from their youth will hopefully go on to be driven, gain lots of skills, and therefore be able to get into better paid work where they can generate more wealth. Now, the next one could just be pure luck. Some people might choose a career that just happens to go on to see wage rates increase significantly. So look at Premier League football players, how their wages have exploded in the last 20 years as the Premier League has grown in popularity. Well, their incomes have shot up massively, which has allowed them to generate more wealth. Now, women in football have not had the same opportunities. So male football's become more popular, female football has become more popular, but nowhere near as much, and that has driven more income and wealth inequality. Now, linked to this as well, and look, you could argue where you live in the country will also affect wealth inequality. So for those that bought property in London and they see massive increases in property prices over time, will see their wealth increase significantly, whereas those of us in the rest of the country have not seen our property grow in value anywhere near as much, and that has led to a gap opening up in the wealth of people in the southeast of England and London in particular, and the rest of the country. Just a few more. What we're focusing on here though now is not just people within an economy, but different economies across the world. So the idea would be that average wage rates and income levels, wealth levels vary from one country to another. So you might find, for example, in African countries, lots of Asian economies, South American economies, that people earn less on average, have less wealth than people in other parts of the world. Now, here are some ideas that could drive this. Education and training. Okay, so the quality of human capital. Some countries are much better at developing the skills of workers than other countries. The more skilled and educated somebody is, the more productive they are, and that allows them to apply for better paid work than people that don't have those opportunities. Next one, minimum wage rates. Well, these vary significantly across the world. Some countries don't even have them at all. So those that have strong minimum wages in place will probably have higher average incomes and therefore more wealth than countries that don't have these options. Next one is the strength of trade unions in a country. Now, a trade union is an organisation that represents the interests of its members, and these are workers that work in particular professions. So what a trade union will be able to do is to negotiate on behalf of the workers better terms and conditions and better rates of pay. So countries that have strong trade unions will probably be able to negotiate higher wage rates for its workers, countries that have very weak trade unions. The next one, employment protection. This one is linked to the government. Again, it could be linked to minimum wages, but it could be linked to working conditions, how difficult it is to hire and fire people. Again, countries that have better employment protection will probably have higher incomes and wealth than countries that don't have this option. In other words, in poorer countries where there is no real employment protection, workers can get exploited by their bosses, and therefore that will drive more inequality across society. The next one is social benefits. So in the UK, for example, we have unemployment benefits, old age pensions. We have other benefits that top up the incomes of low-income earners through universal credit, contribute towards people's rent on their property, childcare costs. And again, countries that have that, that's what I would call that safety net in place to protect low-income earners, will have more income and wealth than countries that don't offer that system. How progressive the tax system is. So remember, a progressive tax is this idea that the more money you earn, the higher percent tax you will pay on your income. Now, in many countries in Europe in particular, we have a very progressive tax system where high income earners pay a high percentage tax and low income earners pay a very low percentage tax. Well, in these countries, you tend to find that the inequality will be lower than countries that don't have these taxes in place. Now, alongside this as well, what these taxes do, they allow for redistribution of income and wealth. If high income earners and wealth owners are paying higher taxes, that isn't often used to provide social benefits and offer more education and training and healthcare to lower paid people across an economy. Access and size of pensions. When you retire, you obviously no longer work. If there are good pensions in place within an economy, well, those people will earn more and have more wealth than countries that don't have these options. Now, ownership of assets is clearly another thing as well. So because we live in a wealthy economy, lots of people in our country will inherit property, inherit wealth from family. In poor countries across the world, they don't have this original wealth. They've got less assets to pass on to future generations. And that can lead to growing income and wealth inequality across the world. Next question, everyone. So again, write these down. Jot down your answers whilst the video is paused. Once you've put down your answers, if you can hit play, please. Right, so you've got here then, everyone, a Lorenz curve. Now look at the diagram in the top right-hand corner. What we have on the horizontal axis is the cumulative percent of the income of a country. So going from 0 up to 100%. On the other axis, we have the percentage of the households of the country. Now, you can flip these axes round and you're going to get exactly the same result. Now, look what we've got then in this top right-hand corner. What this shows is a line of perfect equality. Now, if we operate on this line, it would mean that we have full equality. So there might be lots of absolute poverty in the country, but there will be no relative poverty because there's no inequality in the country at all. Okay, so to give you an example, if you look at the cumulative percentage of households axis, first of all, what this shows is that 30% of the households of the country control 30% of the income. 50% of households have got 50% of the income of the country. Now, what the Lorenz curve shows us is the reality of the situation. So look at the pink line. Now, what this shows here then is that the poorest households receive lower income than the richest households in the country. Now, from the Lorenz curve, we can calculate the Gini coefficient. And this is a measurement of the degree of inequality within an economy. Now, the Gini coefficient will grade every country from 0 to 1. 1 would show full inequality, which means all the country's income and wealth is controlled by one household. A score of 0 would show full equality. Now, sometimes in exams they'll talk about the Gini index, which ranks countries in a very similar way, but from 0 to 100. 100 again would show full inequality, and 0 would show full equality. So the UK, for example, is roughly 0.35. If the number fell down towards, let's say, 0.3, it would mean we've got more equality in the country. If the number goes up from 0.35 to 0.4, it would mean we've got a growth in inequality within our economy. Now, what I would say, though, is measuring inequality is a very, very difficult thing to do. And you've got some reasons at the bottom of the page which you can read through, which will explain why this is a very difficult concept to measure. Right, anyway, moving on. What I would now like to do, please, is to jot down your answers for A, B, and C, D now. Again, whilst you're writing down the answers, hit pause. Once you've put down your answers, hit play, please. Right, so you've got here then the Kuznets Curve. And what we're measuring here is how inequality generally changes as economies develop and grow. Now, what you would expect if you look at the horizontal axis is that as time progresses, the income per capita would increase across an economy. And the logic is, as economies grow, that growth in GDP will mean that on average, access more goods and services. Now, we're going to start off on the left-hand side, on the Kuznets curve, that blue line, where we have very low incomes per head of the population and very low inequality. Now, we're going back here to a pre-industrial world, so before economies have developed industry. So the idea would be that everyone will be poor in this world. So inequality is low. It could mean that everyone is living in absolute poverty, but overall inequality will be very low. Now, the idea would be that when the economy starts to grow and industrialise, create more factories, etc., some people will perform better than others. So the idea would be that some people will have naturally more talent, more skills, more entrepreneurial ability. There might be a bit of luck involved in this as well. But those people will say that their incomes grow massively as they develop more profits, therefore generate higher incomes from more wealth that have been accumulated. Whereas for everyone else, they might see their incomes grow at a much slower rate. So inequality tends to grow massively. Now, when this happens as well, what I would say is that the government are not really using a progressive tax system. So those with wealth are able to use that wealth to build up more wealth, more incomes. So these are the factory owners, the business owners, and they can exploit those in desperation that need work. So this in many ways was Britain during the Industrial Revolution. The incomes of the poor did grow, but far less significantly than those of the rich. It kind of relied on the trickle-down effect to support growth. Now, what then happens is there will be a peak level of inequality. So where the gap between the rich and the poor is at its highest. Now, what will start to happen now as the economy keeps on growing is that governments will have to start representing the interests of workers more. So in Britain, for example, in the 19th century, genuinely it was rich men who were allowed to vote for the government. But over time, people fought for more rights, more influence, and all men were given the right to vote, and eventually women were given the right to vote. Now, what government suddenly had to start doing was representing the interests of those workers. So suddenly we had a progressive tax system introduced. We start offering lower paid people the access to social benefits by using the incomes of the taxes from those rich people. And that led to the gap closing. So in Britain, for example, we rolled out the National Health Service, giving people free access to healthcare, with education brought in. We had financial benefits, unemployment benefits creep into the economy as well. What has also seen that decline in inequality as well since the Industrial Revolution is the strength of trade unions. So as trade unions built up more power and influence, they were able to negotiate against these bosses, these factory owners, to get better wages for their workers. It is worth noting, though, that inequality at the moment is starting to go back up again. And this is partly down to the decline in the power of trade unions. Right, guys, last thing. Capitalism. So free market economics. Now, free market economics, though, does thrive on the idea of inequality. For the success of free market economics, we need to have a degree of inequality. And many would argue this is exactly fair, is what we call equitable. And the idea is those that work the hardest, those that gain the most skills, take the most risks and create businesses, will generate higher incomes and wealth than those that don't. So the idea would be, in a free market economy, if you want to better yourself, the logic is you invest in your skills and talents to upgrade your human capital and productivity, and you invest and create businesses. So that would incentivize the economy to become more efficient over time. The logic would also then be the trickle-down effect would happen. As economies grow and those with more incomes see their incomes and wealth increased even more, they will be creating more job opportunities and offer better wages for the poor. But this would see a growth in poverty and inequality within an economy. The final thing, though, is some would argue that inequality can become too unfair in free market economics. If the gap becomes too big, it could mean the poorer people can't access the opportunities to fulfill their potential. So if poor people can't access sufficient education or food or healthcare, they will never get the opportunity to fulfill their potential. So even though inequality might be a good thing to a certain extent, because it incentivizes hard work, it's what we call a motivation structure. And the problem is if it's too high, we could be holding back the potential of millions of low-paid workers across the economy. And this could limit potential economic growth in a country. Right, thank you very much, everyone. That's Poverty and Inequality finished.